Chapter 6, The Revolution Within. And as promised at the end of the last chapter, I will keep this one shorter than that one. The American Revolution, it kind of took three forms. First, there was a struggle for national independence, and there was faced a long-term worldwide contest among the European empires. And then there was this big conflict here over what kind of a nation is this new America going to become. And because of its very wide property distribution, the absence of a legally established hereditary society, very weak established church, colonial America had the potential to become very democratic. And the revolution released this potential, it allowed space for political and social struggles to expand the ideas of freedom and to even challenge the traditional power structure. And although the revolutionary leaders were almost all from the American elite, white male, and although the lower classes did not seize power, the very idea of liberty, it kind of animated the attacks on both British and domestic American institutions. So this notion of equality, enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, which caused many in the social order who were deemed inferior, such as women and slaves and free blacks and servants and apprentices, they began to question the authority of their superiors. And by the revolution's end, the authority of the male heads of household over women and children and slave owners over their slaves was still intact. But for free men, the revolution had been very democratic and had very democratic effects, especially in the challenging of the traditional limitation of political participation to the property owners. A democracy at this time had a little bit different meaning than it does now, and it meant many things, including direct rule by the population. Of course, that's considered mob rule, or the mixed constitution of England. But during the revolution, it came to mean a form of government that served the interest of the people, the common people, rather than just the elite. And in the colonies that did become states, members of all different classes, well, they talked and debated about something called universal male suffrage. They talked about religious toleration, and even some broached the subject of the abolition of slavery. But demands by the disenfranchised militiamen, they wanted the right to elect their own officers and vote in political elections, which they didn't have. So they began to establish a precedent for enfranchising the veterans. Now, the revolution's radicalism was most evident in Pennsylvania, where almost all of the colonial elite opposed independence. They were so sure that it would cause the rabble or the underclass, the propertyless people, to rule and to attack those who had property. In their opposition, well, it opens up a group for pro-independent forces, mainly the artisans and the lower class, to organize in extra-legal groups and militias, and led by men of modest means such as Thomas Paine and Benjamin Rush, a physician. Now, these men were criticizing property qualifications for voting and office holding. And shortly after our independence, Pennsylvania adopted a new constitution. It abolished the governor's office. It ended any qualifications whatsoever for office holding. And it concentrated all the power into a one-house legislature, which would be elected annually by all men, all white men over the age of 21 who paid taxes. And it also established public schools and guaranteed free speech. This is just a copy of the working draft, of the Pennsylvania Constitution. Now, every state adopted a new constitution, either during the Revolution or immediately after. And almost all Americans agreed that their state government should be Republican, meaning that the authority should rest on the consent of the governed. That's a key phrase, consent of those that are being governed. And that no king or hereditary or aristocracy should ever be established. But Americans disagreed about the form Republican government should take to best promote this idea. Now, John Adams and a lot of others were very critical of the Pennsylvania's one-house legislature. They said it's too radical. And they argued that this new constitution should establish governments that reflect the division of the society between the wealthy to be represented in the legislature's upper house, and the ordinary, the common man, who would be represented in the lower house. A powerful governor and a judiciary would act as a check on the power of one class to infringe on the rights of the other class. That sounds good, but every state except Pennsylvania, Vermont, and Georgia established a two-house legislature, but only Massachusetts gave its governor the power to veto laws passed by the legislature. It seems Americans wanted a strong legislative branch, but they're still having trouble deciding just how we're going to best go about this. Far more controversial were the limits on voting and office holding. While some conservatives tried to restrict these rights to the property owners, arguing that men without property were too dependent upon others to have their own judgment. Radicals such as Thomas Paine wanted to eliminate traditional social ranks. Now, to give you an example, and it's been universal through history, and I can understand part of it. Say you lived in Somerville, and you're renting an apartment. Your only thing you do is you go to work. You don't have any property that you own. And I live in Somerville, and I own the land my house is on, and I go to work. Now we have an election, and we both go to vote. Who's going to be more dependable to decide on what's best for Somerville? Is it going to be someone who owns property here, or someone who's just renting an apartment who can pull up and move to North Charleston at any time they want to? So that this is the key behind it. They figured if you don't own property in the area where you live, you cannot be dependent upon to vote what's best for the area. And in some ways, it does make a little bit of sense. But this new constitutions that the states are coming up kind of reflects the balance of power between conservatives and radicals, and we still have a lot of those around. Southern states, well, such as Virginia and South Carolina, were the least democratic of all. They continued to allow the landed gentry to control politics by retaining the property qualifications for voting and allowing their legislature to elect the governor. The more democratic constitutions in other states began moving toward voting an entitlement to vote rather than, it's not a privilege to vote, it's going to be an entitlement, one of those things. But they did not establish universal male suffrage. Only in Vermont did they not require the voters to own property or pay taxes to vote. So ultimately the revolution, well, it expanded the voting rights, yes. And by the 1780s, except for Virginia, Maryland, and New York, the largest percentage of white male adults could vote. Among the states, New Jersey, all blessed New Jersey. She wrote her Constitution. She was in such a hurry, she forgot to use the word male. And women could vote until 1808, although they didn't vote because they didn't know they could, but it was legal if they had been allowed to. But for women and any non-white, getting a vote is going to be a long process, an uphill battle. But by the revolution's end, freedom and the right to vote and participate in politics, it come to mean almost the same thing if you were white and male. Now, the revolution also expanded religious freedoms. And although a few of the colonies, like Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, they tolerated different religious groups before the revolution, the freedom to worship elsewhere kind of came from the reality of religious pluralism. Because before the revolution, most colonies supported religious institutions with the public funds. Your taxes paid for it. And by doing that, they discriminated against certain sects like the Catholics and the Jews, and even some Protestants who they didn't like. They discriminated against them and they wouldn't let them hold office. And there was a very deep anti-Catholic feeling in colonial America. But the revolution did weaken it some. We approved a plan to invade Canada. And the Second Continental Congress invited the Catholic inhabitants of Quebec to join Protestant American revolutionaries. And then once we formed that alliance with the Catholic nation of France, well, France was pivotal in our victory. So Catholics were starting to be seen as having a role, although small, in our new nation. The end of the British rule led many to challenge the privileges of the established Anglican Church in several of the colonies. And some of our leaders, such as Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, what they wanted to do was to avoid any kind of a religious-driven political conflict that, kind of took over Europe and had for centuries. So while viewing religion as a necessity and a basis for public morality, there were also skeptics and rationalists who were steeped in the Enlightenment philosophy, and they believed in a benevolent creator, not in divine intervention in human affairs. So the push to separate the church and state united the deists, those who believed in a non-interfering God, like Thomas Jefferson and evangelical Protestants, who wanted to protect religion from the corruption of government. So throughout the United States, states deprived the established churches of their public funding and their special legal privileges, and several states even under their constitution, guaranteed the free exercise of religion. It sounds good and looks good on paper, but religious toleration was not universal. Every state except New York retained laws barring Jews from voting and holding office. 7 different states limited office holding to Protestants only, and Massachusetts retained its congressional establishment well into the 19th century. Catholics, well, they didn't manage to gain the right to worship freely throughout the former colonies, but slowly. Thomas Jefferson was a very important figure in the advancement of religious liberty. In 1779, he wrote something called a Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom for the Virginia Legislature. It was adopted until 6 years later in 1786, but a lot of controversy before it got adopted. But Jefferson saw the established churches as tyrannies that constrained free thought, and the bill eliminated religious requirements for voting and office holding, government financial support for the church. So religious liberty became the model for the revolutionary generation. The definition of rights is a private matter to be protected from government. So in a very Christian, but not very pious, United States, the separation of church and state drew a line between public authority and a private sphere in which rights existed as a limitation on government power. And here's just a copy of the typed up draft of Thomas Jefferson's Virginia Bill. We also begin to see challenges against the religious institution and their authority. And your text mentions that the Moravians who migrated to America from Germany, with the younger members, insisted that they had the liberty to conduct their own affairs, including arranging their own marriages. So by allowing for the growth of different denominations, the separation of church and state actually began to expand the religion's influence in our society. The Americans, the Presbyterians, the Congregationalists, they all faced growing dissent from the sects such as the Baptist and the Universalist. Although they separated church and state, the revolutionaries' leaders were not anti-religious. Most were devout Christians, and even the deists who opposed organized churches thought that religious values were the foundation of a republic's morality. And some states continued to bar non-Christians from political office and prosecute people for blasphemy or violating the Sabbath. But the revolutionary leaders worried about the character of our citizens. They worried about their virtue. Did they have the ability to sacrifice self-interest for the public good, public virtue? And some promoted free public schools as a way to prepare our citizens for a civic life of participation in government that would be required of a free people. It also, the revolution, redefined and reshaped the economic freedom. Slavery was only one of many kinds of unfree labor in our colonial America. But after the revolution, the decline of indentured servitude and apprenticeships, and the transformation of paid domestic service into a job for black and white women, made unfree labor for white men increasingly rare. As wage labor became more common, as Republican citizenship seemed more and more incompatible with the restraints of apprenticeship and indentured servitude, it kind of came to a halt. And by 1800, when indentured servitude had virtually ceased to exist in our country, a distinction had hardened between freedom and slavery. And a northern economy based on free labor, in other words, a man working for wages or a man owning his own farm or shop, and the southern economy based on slave labor. So the line is being drawn. For the question of what constituted the social conditions of freedom, well, it interested Americans during this time. And many believed that the Republic could not survive with a large number of dependent citizens who, being subject to the power and influence of a superior and independent man, would be corrupted. And men such as Thomas Jefferson saw land ownership for all white men as the key to ensuring a Republican future for the nation. He wanted to see everyone have their own land and be self-sufficient. He did not like big cities at all. He didn't like cities, period. Many Americans thought, because of the abundance of land, and a lot of it occupied by Indians, it's going to ensure Republican liberty and social equality. And like I say on the slide, never mind that the land is already occupied. We want it. We're going to take it. The Revolution exacerbated the conflict about whether local or national government should ensure household independence and Americans' livelihood by limiting price increase. Price control. To finance the war, Congress had issued hundreds of millions of dollars in paper money. And that, combined with the, shall we say, disruptions to agriculture and trade, and hoarding, even and then we had hoarding by merchants who they wanted to profit from shortage later on. And after the war, of course, this caused extraordinary price increases. And in many cases, Americans were beginning to riot against the merchants and demand they charge a just price. They don't mind you making a profit, they just don't want you to make the whole month's profit off of one sale. In 1779, inflation was so great that the Continental Congress asked the states to pass laws fixing wages and prices. A move that, embodied the idea that a Republican government should promote the public good, not the self-interest of an individual. Good thinking. The government should promote the public good, not the self-interest of individuals. But we had some Americans who argued for free trade, and they believed that prosperity flowed from economic self-interest. And Adam Smith, our little Scottish economist, in his treaty, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, they were influenced by his arguments that the invisible hand of the free market directed economic life more fairly and effectively than government intervention. In other words, it's called laissez-faire, government hands-off. They argued that once America's trade was independent from British control, the natural workings of the economy would ensure the nation's prosperity. Okay. And not all Americans experienced the revolution and its effects, shall we say, as an expansion of their freedom. There were many individuals who maintained their allegiance to the British crown, called Loyalists, which we discussed briefly, and they lost all their liberties. Many Loyalists, which included men and women from all social classes, they had supported resistance in the 1760s, but they opposed this idiotic fight for war, and they just didn't want to fight England. So about 20 to 25% of free Americans were Loyalists, and 20,000 Loyalists even actually fought for the British. And there were Loyalists in every colony, but they were the most numerous in New York, Pennsylvania, and the backwoods of Georgia and the Carolinas. And I have it up there, 20% were Loyalists, which is 1/5. 40% were against either side, pox on both your houses. New York, Pennsylvania, and backcountry of Georgia and Carolina, just leave us alone. And 40% were patriots. So actually we only had about 40% of the population who were really willing to fight. The Revolutionary War, it took on the quality of a civil war in a lot of places. Because neighbors intimidated and assaulted each other, and they paddled on each other, and they reported on each other, and then there were the pacifists who refused to bear arms and were arrested, their property seized. A lot of states began to require oaths of allegiance, and those who refused were stripped of their voting rights or expelled. Some Loyalists had their property confiscated. Some of them were put in prison. Thomas Jefferson's son, who was the president of the governor of New Jersey, was a Loyalist, and he was put in an underground prison. And when the war ended, about 100,000 Loyalists were exiled or voluntarily immigrated from the United States. Some who stayed were reintegrated into American society, but the sad thing is those 100,000 Loyalists, they were of the upper class. They were the educated. They were the businessmen. They were the lawyers and the judges. And they were people we really couldn't afford to lose. We needed them to stay here and help us. Now here's a map showing you that the pink spots are the heavy pink spots, not this over here. But, here's North Carolina. Just in through here is where your Loyalist was. The Indians, oh my, they faced the revolution as a great loss of their freedoms. Because between the proclamation of 1763 and the American Revolution, the colonists have continued to move westward, and they keep claiming Indian lands east of the Mississippi River in that Northwest Territory. And a lot of the leaders during the Revolution, including our beloved George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, they were very much involved in what we call land speculation. And the British efforts to stop the land speculation had been one of the biggest complaints of the Virginians supporting the independent revolution. And different Indian tribes backed the British and some backed the Americans. And some tribes, like the Iroquois, they split internally and fought each other. But the Americans and their Indian enemies inflicted atrocities on each other and civilians, and it would continue even until after the war. Now, independence created state governments that were democratically accountable to voters who wanted the Indian lands. A lot of them, including Thomas Jefferson, saw the war as an opportunity to secure more land and liberty for white Americans by expelling or conquering the Indians. The Treaty of Paris marked the end of a process whereby power in eastern North America moved from the Indian to the white Americans, and limiting the British in eastern North America to Canada. The agreement led the British to abandon their Indian allies and recognize American sovereignty over the entire region east of the Mississippi River, disregarding the natives who lived there. So for white Americans, freedom in possessing land and limiting the Indian. But for the Indian, they didn't understand how you could own land. You can't own the land, the air you breathe. But for African Americans, the revolutionaries' ideas in the war, it presented an opportunity for freedom, they thought. In 1776, 1/5 of the new nation's inhabitants, about 500,000, were slaves. Slavery was central to the language of the Revolution, and other than liberty, it was the word most often used in legal and political writings. Slavery was defined as the opposite of liberty in political and meaning, and what it really meant was it signified the denial of an individual's personal and political rights by an arbitrary government. And even people who owned slaves, resisting and fighting the British, expressed that they were being enslaved by the British. By the Revolution's end, slavery was entrenched in every American colony. Every founding father, 99.9% of the founding fathers, people in the North and South, they all owned slaves at one point. And when writing of man's unalienable rights, the right to the liberty and the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson owned 100 slaves at that time. And if he hadn't had the slaves, he wouldn't have been able to pursue his leisure in arts and science. We know that. And some patriots argued that slavery for blacks allowed freedom for whites, removing the dependent poor from the political nation and giving a white man economic independence. Of course, John Locke's vision of the political community as a whole was that of a group of individuals who contracted together to protect their natural rights, and they also used that same argument to defend slavery. The rights of self-government and the protection of property from government interference, some argued. It prevented the government from interfering with the human property, which they considered their property. Government intervention with their slave property, these white slave owners argued, would make slaves of them. So you use the word slavery to justify having slavery. So by making liberty an absolute value and defining freedom as a universal entitlement rather than a set of rights, it limits it to a particular place or people. The revolution inevitably led to the questions about slavery and its status. Does it have a place in our new nation? And before independence, Slavery was rarely discussed in public, even though there were some enlightened people who were thinking that the institution was immoral and ineffective, and it was a relic of ancient barbarism. The Quakers in the 1600s had protested slavery, and by the time the American Revolution started, many Pennsylvania Quakers had come to oppose slavery openly. And only with the Revolution did slavery begin to emerge as a subject of public debate and controversy and get it out in the open. Many slaves, especially those in the Northeast, realized that the Revolution's definition of liberty as a universal right opened the door for them to use the same language to challenge their bondage. And African Americans were the most persistent advocates of freedom as a universal entitlement. And they pressed revolutionary whites to follow their own principles, practice what you preach. And in the early 1770s, enslaved blacks in New England presented petition after petition to courts and legislatures, asking Americans fighting the English tyranny to end the tyranny with which Americans exercised over their slaves. Of course, the war offered opportunities for escape, and the incident would seem to increase during the conflict. And although some 5,000 slaves fought for the American independence, by which some gained their freedom, mostly in the New England area, many more slaves obtained their liberty by siding with the British. The several different proclamations by the British generals offered freedom to slaves who enlisted in the British military. Nearly 100,000 slaves, including many in Georgia and South Carolina, escaped and fled to the British lines. And although by the end of the war many had been recaptured, there was over 20,000 who faced return to their owners. Like George Washington, dear old beloved George, he insisted that they rejoin their owners. They were property. But the British refused, and a lot of them immigrated to England or other British colonies. The Revolution momentarily seemed to threaten the perpetuation of slavery. During the war, most states banned or discouraged the further importation of African slaves, and the conflict devastated many southern plantations. In the 1780s, a significant number of slaveholders, especially in Virginia and Maryland, they even freed their slaves. This happened rarely, believe me. But between 1777, when Vermont's new constitution prohibited slavery, in 1804, when New Jersey banned slavery, every state north of Maryland moved towards emancipation. That was the first time in history that a legislature had ever acted to end slavery. But even in the North, slaves' importance as property, it kind of shaped the way they were emancipated. Most northern laws allowed for what we call gradual emancipation. The living slave was not free. Only the children of slave mothers would become free after serving the master until adulthood. And this was to compensate for the loss of property. And many northern slave owners were just as reluctant as the southern slave owners to free their slaves after the war. So the Revolution, it kind of had a contradictory impact on American slavery and American freedom. Emancipation in the North, however gradual, came to distinguish free from slave states. And Northern abolition, voluntary abolition, emancipation in the South, and slave escapees began to create large, free black communities for the very first time in American history. Free black communities had their own leaders. They established their own independent churches and schools. Well, I should say in all states except Maryland, South Carolina, and Georgia. A free black man who met tax paying or property requirements could even vote. But nevertheless, slavery survived the Revolutionary War and thrived in its aftermath. By 1790, there were 700,000 slaves in the United States, 200,000 more than there had been 14 years ago. And women contributed to the struggle for national independence. At least one woman that we know that has been documented disguised herself as a man, enlisted in the Continental Army, and fought in several battles. And she wasn't discovered that she was a woman until she was wounded, and the doctor started taking her clothes off to fix her up and discovered that she had the body of a woman. Other patriot women, while they posed as merchants, they would sneak behind lines. They had these big full skirts, and of course, a woman who was put on a pedestal, and no one would think of searching a woman beyond asking her if she had anything. They could put it in her bustle. They could put it in her hoop skirt. There were so many places a woman could hide merchandise. Some women actually flirted and got secrets out of men to pass on. Some women just protested the merchants who were charging high prices. Some women, they made shirts and socks and things for the army. Some women formed the Ladies' Association to just raise money because it was hard getting payment. In one instance, and I'm trying to remember when it was, we talked about it in American Women's History. The Women's Association had raised over $100,000, and they gave the money to George Washington to pay his troops, and George wouldn't accept it and told him they could not pay the troops. It had to come from the government. I thought, whoa, okay. But George was a very stickler for rules. Abigail Adams, she was always fussing at her husband, John Adams, to remember the ladies when you established a new government and rights in our new nation. Now, this is a picture of her in later life, of course. But nevertheless, gender remained an important boundary of freedom in America. Independence did not change the family law inherited from Britain. Husbands still held legal authority over the body, property, and choices of their wives. And while political freedom for men meant the right to self-government and consent over the political arrangements that ruled them, for women, the marriage contract was more important than the social contract. Because women's relationship to society was mediated through her relationship to her husband. Because women lacked the essential basis of political participation. Autonomy was founded on property ownership or control over one's own person, which women did not have. And most men considered women actually submissive and irrational, especially during certain times of the month. And therefore, they were unfit for citizenship. So public debate in the Revolutionary era saw men's rights as natural entitlements. A woman's role was viewed in the terms of duty and obligation, and their rights flowed from their roles as wives and mothers. By definition, the Republican citizen was male. Yet the Revolution did improve the status somewhat. The ideology of the Republican motherhood. It gave women the responsibility to train future citizens. Apparently, somebody finally woke up and said, you know, we're demanding our women raise our sons and teach them how to be good Republican citizens, and yet we're not allowing them to be educated or anything. And the leaders began to believe that the morality of the nation would be developed by women within the household and family. Yeah. And while it ruled out women's direct participation in politics, this bone, I call it thrown as a bone, Republican motherhood did encourage the expansion of women's educational opportunities. I mean, you can't teach your son how to read if you don't know how to read. It also began to strengthen the idea of a compassionate marriage. In other words, you would marry because you were fond of each other, instead of having your father arrange the marriage. It changed the family structure a bit. And while slaves as dependents on the male head of household remained part of the owner's family in the South, in the North, hired wage earners replacing the indentured servant and slave that once been considered family members were not even seen as part of the household. So this was one of the downsides of emancipation. The Revolution changed the lives of all Americans. On one hand, the right to vote extended for the white male. Bound labor among whites declined. Religious groups had greater freedom. And blacks began to challenge the institution of slavery. But on the other hand, Indians, Native Americans, the Loyalists, and the slaves, they experienced a great loss of freedom in the Revolution. Many Americans saw the Revolution as a struggle for freedom with worldwide significance. And the Revolution did inspire other fights for national independence and social equality, like the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution and the Latin American Wars. But the struggle over the meaning of freedom within the United States is going to continue long after independence has been won. Now, these are two very short YouTubes. I think one's 2.5 and the other's 2.5. The first one is about Abigail Adams. The other one's about John Adams. And it's the only YouTubes you're going to see on this lesson. And I think Abigail Adams is one of my very favorite women in history.
Miss, do you want to go on a virtual date with Josh Duhamel? Oh, of course. Which one
Gotta
of these
see our commercial.
Abigail Adams' greatest legacy, I think, to the role of First Lady is that if you are political by nature, be fully political.
She was born on November 11, 1744, in Weymouth, Massachusetts.
She was encouraged by her parents to read and to study.
And it wasn't just in the basics, it was also in Shakespearean literature, it was in letters, the classics.
In 1762, Abigail was reunited with John Adams, an old acquaintance from her childhood. He was smitten by Abigail's knowledge of poetry, philosophy, and politics.
They met when she was 15 and he was 27.
There was a strong shared values.
John and Abigail Adams married on October 25, 1764. They had 6 children over 10 years, but John's duties as a politician kept him away from home for long stretches.
John and Abigail Adams spent years apart, and yet it never seemed to impair their relationship.
John Adams was helping to foment the revolution that would lead to independence. He continually reported to Abigail through their letters.
The letters of John and Abigail Adams still serve as one of the most prized artifacts in the United States history.
If you read their letters, you find a great deal of affection between them.
They give us not only a very personal sense of who the two of them were, they give us also a sense of the uncertainty of the creation of the United States of America.
The role of John Adams in the Revolution elevated his status as a politician. He served as vice president for 2 terms under President Washington.
She was very persuasive in her husband questioning George and Martha Washington and Thomas Jefferson's commitment to slavery.
In 1796, John Adams became the 2nd president of the United States.
Abigail Adams couldn't help but express her opinion.
She had some really tough quotes about her white male peers. She called them out pretty much as being hypocrites, and that was pretty bold.
Abigail's critics returned fire with claims that her political activism was meddling in the president's affairs.
She was even sarcastically called Mrs. President for the very overt political role that she took.
John Adams lost the election of 1800 to his rival, Thomas Jefferson. The Adams retired to Quincy, Massachusetts.
John and Abigail Adams were able to spend real time together. They had time to really reconnect.
She didn't live to see her son, John Quincy Adams, become president, but she had great confidence that he would continue to rise politically.
Abigail Adams died on October 28, 1818. She was 73 years old.
Abigail Adams is one of my, as I said, favorite people in history altogether. She was a beautiful woman, exceptionally educated, and spoke her mind. I guess you'd say she was a women's libber long before it was proper to be a woman's lib. Now, I'm not going to ask you to know all the presidents, of course, but you do need to know a little bit about John Adams. He had to have been good because Abigail loved him.
Only on Amazon Prime Instant Video.
You built these things? Yes, I'm a scientist.
John Adams was the first vice president and the 2nd president of America. He is highly regarded as one of the most influential founding fathers of the United States. He was born on October 30th, 1735, in Braintree, Massachusetts. John Adams was the great-great-grandson of John and Priscilla Alden, pilgrims who landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620. His father was a farmer and cordwainer, a maker of leather goods, who also served as a church deacon. John had 2 brothers, Peter and Elihu. Elihu died during the American Revolution. John Adams died on July 4th, 1826, in Quincy, Massachusetts. The career of John Adams included the roles of a lawyer, diplomat, politician, and statesman. He advanced to the position of vice president, serving under George Washington from 1789 to 1797. He became the 2nd president of America in 1797 and served for 4 years until 1801. John Adams married Abigail Smith on October 25, 1764. They had 5 children, whose names were Abigail Amelia, John Quincy, Susanna, Charles, and Thomas Boylston. The Adams were the first residents to live in the Executive Mansion, later called the White House. The first child to live in the White House was their 4-year-old granddaughter, Susanna. His son, John Quincy Adams, was destined to become the 6th President of the United States. John Adams belonged to the Federalist political party. He was 61 years old when he was inaugurated as the 2nd President. Thomas Jefferson stood as the Vice President. In 1800, the White House became the official home of American presidents. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both signed the Declaration of Independence prior to being elected as Presidents of America. John Adams had a slight figure, standing at 5 feet 7 inches. His color was unusually high. His face was often red from exertion, and his blue eyes blazed. He was well-knit, muscular, and quick and sure in his movements. During his lifetime, he played a key role in major events of the era, notably the XYZ affair and the naval quasi-war with France. John Adams was instrumental in exposing the XYZ affair, providing Congress with letters from the Peace Commission indicating French efforts to bribe and intimidate U.S. officials. During his life, John Adams suffered from respiratory infections and depression. When he was young, he was inoculated against smallpox and spent 3 weeks in the hospital, suffering headaches, backaches, knee aches, gagging fever, and an eruption of pockmarks. As he aged, most of his teeth fell out, but he refused to wear dentures and therefore talked with a lisp. He was 90 years old when he died of heart failure and pneumonia on July 4, 1826, in Quincy, Massachusetts. He was buried in the family crypt beneath the United First Parish Church. Coincidentally, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died within a few hours of each other on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1826. So ends our short biography about the life and presidency of John Adams. He was the first Vice President and the 2nd President of America. He is highly regarded as one of the most influential founding fathers of the United States. The next U.S. President was Thomas Jefferson. This video is one of a series covering all of the American presidents and has been created by www.facts-about.org.uk as a free educational resource. This unique collection of videos has been developed to enable students to gain a fast overview of the lives of each of the U.S. presidents, together with the key events which occurred during their presidency. Discover the range of videos that are available on the Facts About website and use them as a fast dynamic learning aid, which will add variety to conventional study methods and help to increase knowledge retention.
I guess I could have waited till the next chapter because we haven't got a constitution or president yet. The next chapter covers the making of the Constitution and our first president and 2nd president, of which he was the 2nd president. Like I said, I'm not too fond of John Adams. He's not my favorite founding father. But he had to have had qualities that I have not discovered yet, even though I've read his biography, because I adore Abigail Adams, and if she loved him, he had to have had some redeeming qualities. What do I want you to remember from this chapter? Basically, we're kind of in a flux. People are confused. The rich, the propertyless, the Indians, the slaves. I mean, it's kind of like you released all restrictions on a 16-year-old and told her just go out and do what she wants to do, make her own rules. The rules have got to be made. If you don't have some rules, you're going to have chaos and anarchy. The rich are afraid of the unpropertied masses. They've always been afraid of the mob or the lower class. The lower class wants more freedom, this freedom and liberty. It's like eating popcorn. Once you get a little bit of it, you want more. It's very confusing. And even though we have won the war, if we're not careful, we're going to come completely untogether. And that's what next chapter will cover. The problems that the nation is facing because of a weak federal government. We do not have United States. We have 13 individual states fighting amongst themselves. It's going to turn into a very bad scene, which thankfully we're going to be able to turn around.